But this evening we're only going back to the 20th century. Our lecturer, Ben Montgomery, is an investigative reporter for the Tampa Bay Times who spent years documenting the incredible and tragic story of the Dozier School for Boys, Florida's oldest reform school. It's a story that couldn't have been told without the contribution of forensic archaeology. Ben's series, For Their Own Good, earned him the Dart Award and the Casey Medal. He's also a 2010 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. And he's also a damn good writer. We're very pleased to welcome Ben to Timesifters.
Thanks. Thank you for that kind introduction, Glenn. It made me sound very important. I am not. And it's interesting that I'm addressing a group of archaeologists and people interested in archaeology, because I sort of ran up against maybe some of you all or some of your peers a couple of years ago when I took the state to task for raiding the homes of 13 arrowhead collectors across the state of Florida, using sort of SWAT-style operation to take them down after a 2-year undercover investigation into people who collect, buy, sell, and trade points. So I heard from a lot of archaeologists suggesting that these guys were looters, and they had to be prosecuted criminally in some respect, and evidently that operation has put a big dent in the novice collector community. So anyhow, I'm happy to be here. This has been 7 years of my life working on this, sort of what's been one story about the history of the Dozier School for Boys. I first learned of it in 2008 when I read about it in the newspaper. 5 gentlemen who had been wards of the state at Dozier, which was then called the Florida School for Boys, in the 1950s and 1960s had found each other online. And they convinced a sympathetic state lawmaker who was then working for the Department of Juvenile Justice, a guy named Gus Barrero, to let them have a small ceremony on the campus in front of a squat cinder block building. Where should I point this? There we go. A squat cinder block building that the boys referred to as the White House. I don't think the state, when they agreed to let these men have this ceremony, just sort of an emotional closing of the book for them, and that's what they thought at the time. I don't think the state, when they allowed them to have this ceremony in front of the White House, had any idea the storm that was to follow. Interestingly, the men were given a chance to speak at a podium in front of state bureaucrats, most of them from the Department of Juvenile Justice, but also in front of a couple of reporters, including a reporter for the Associated Press out of the Tallahassee Bureau. And the stories these men told one by one were shocking. They talked about being woken up at night, dragged through the dark in their pajamas into this building, forced face down on a cot. They were told to bite a pillow that was covered with the blood, sometimes the vomit. They described seeing bits of pieces of lip or tongue on the pillow. And then they were brutally beaten by the administration at the school. And this is a time when, as you'll recall, capital punishment was still accepted, but this form of capital punishment went beyond the pale. These men have testified to having received upwards of 100 lashes with a weighted leather strap. And most of the men who spoke that day, there were 5 of them, 4 of them spoke, but most of the men who spoke that day put the blame directly on one man named Troy Tidwell, and they remembered him because he was known as the one-armed man. Mr. Tidwell is still alive and still living in Marietta, and so far hasn't been charged criminally for the things he did. But what happened was, after these men publicly told their story, and the story by the Associated Press ran in papers across the country quoting them, talking about these experiences, seeing blood on the walls, and being beaten so badly that their pajamas or their underwear penetrated the lacerations in their behinds. They remembered having to stand in the shower and watching their own blood flow down the drains. This was a nightmarish sort of story. And I read it and I thought, oh my goodness, one, is this true? And two, if it is true, is there anybody alive to be held accountable? I should add that the men talked about the trauma manifesting itself in a number of ways, both physical and emotional. Many of them had never talked about this before, certainly not publicly. They hadn't told their wives or their children. They had lived with the pain of that experience for 50 years. So I walked over to my editor with the copy of the AP story that had run in the back of the Metro section of the Tampa Bay Times, which then was the St. Petersburg Times. And when I get excited, I grab, I don't know why, but I grab my dog tooth. And so I throw the paper on her desk, and I'm like, here's a story. And she said yes, and that was 7 years ago. It was October of 2008, so a long while ago. When we started work on this, there were a number of different angles to take. First, answering that question, was this true? And that was pretty easy to answer because there'd been a long historical record of journalists showing up at this school in the Panhandle, which Marianna is 60 miles west of Tallahassee. Journalists showing up at this school over the years and finding kids being kept in horrible conditions, finding kids being neglected, and telling stories about kids who described being beaten until their jeans split, or they had to get stitches in their behinds, things like that. Famously, Claude Kirk, the former governor of Florida, showed up in the late 1960s and got a tour of the campus and found kids living in horrible conditions. And he said to the news reporters that had followed him, if your children were kept if you knew your children were kept in these conditions, you'd be up here with shotguns. So this wasn't a secret. It had sort of evaded massive public knowledge, but it certainly wasn't something that had been hidden forever necessarily. There were a number of mass deaths over the years, including a fire in 1914 that caught in a 3-story dormitory. The children were locked in what they called dark rooms, and somewhere between 10 and 12 kids died in that fire. There was an influenza outbreak, several of them actually over the years, that killed another 30 or so kids. And then many of them died under mysterious circumstances. And this is what we got curious about as reporters, myself and my colleague Waveney Ann Moore. A lot of the men who were stepping forward after that original story broke to tell their stories, and all of them very similar, that number that started at 5 grew to about 500. So the men who were coming forward to tell these stories often had stories about their classmates disappearing. And they remembered, scant details. Maybe they had a first name, or they knew the hometown of the boy, and they just remember he was there one day, and then he was taken to the White House for a beating, and he never returned. And so this is what proved hard to figure out. There's not necessarily a historical record of boys who were killed on the campus. It's not like the guards who ran the place were willing to take credit for murder, and so we went in pursuit of that story, and we did it by examining sort of the folklore that was resurfacing 50 years later, and also doing a close examination of the historical record. To give you an example of some of the men who we talked to, and we traveled the state doing the original story about trying to answer the question, was it true? Traveled the state talking to a total of about 50 men. These photographs are by my colleague Edmund Fountain, who I think did a really good job of sort of revealing the pain just by doing portraiture with these guys who had been there. You can see some of the, this has actually sort of been called into question, but you can see what appears to be some of the scarring on the rear end of a man named Dick Colon, who said that came from being beaten at the school. And that's not the exact paddle, but that's a replica of the paddle that all the men sort of collectively agreed that they were beaten with. Oops. So the number grew and grew and grew. This is a small fraction of the men we wound up talking to, but A little context of the school. Yes, ma'am?
Why were they there?
They were there for a number of things. There were boys there for murder. There were boys there for violent crime like rape, armed robbery. There were also boys there for silliness such as truancy or incorrigibility or bike theft.
Prison. They didn't go to Stark.
No, and these were, for the most part, boys under the age of 18. And I'll talk about that right here. The development of the school came about in the late 1800s, and it was preceded by an incident in which, Florida was working under the convict lease system at the time, and a 16-year-old youth who was leased to a turpentine operator was beaten to death by the boss. And the story of this boy's death was covered by newspapers across the state. And the state was embarrassed by the convict lease system, by the idea that 16-year-olds were leased out to folks who made them work. And so there was a legislative effort to establish a school, which was called a school then, but a reform school. And in 1900, the citizens of Jackson County donated 600 acres to the state. There's an interesting racial component to this as well. The landowners, according to the historical record, were the direct descendants of antebellum slaveholders, which was common in Jackson County. There's a famous Battle of Mariana. I'm sure you've heard of this. Interestingly, the Battle of Mariana occurred and is still memorialized in a big way in Jackson County, but the federal troops who rode into town during the Battle of Mariana were by and large African American troops. There were two, as they were called at the time, colored detachment of troops, and most of them rode horseback. And the story has it that they were fantastic marksmen and horsemen, and they laid waste to what was known then as the cradle to grave unit of Confederate soldiers, many of them who were home in Jackson County to recuperate before being sent back north to continue fighting the Civil War. So this outfit of Confederates were really overrun by the African American troops. And then subsequently, the troops rode from plantation to plantation around Jackson County, telling the slaves, "You're free, come with us." And some stories have 600 slaves walking out of Jackson County that day. What happened after that was what's known as the Jackson County War, in which the entitled people in Jackson County committed many, many racial crimes. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 people were killed during this period of unrest. There's a lynching in Jackson County in 1934, the lynching of a man named Claude Neal, who was a 20-year-old illiterate farmhand accused of killing and raping a white farm girl. This was one of the last, what's known as spectacle lynchings in the United States. 5,000 people were said to have participated in the murder and subsequent mutilation of Claude Neal. So there's a racial component to this story, and there's a racial component to this school. Very quickly, it became not just a school and not just a reformatory, but it became a workforce. And when the administrators of the school in the 19-teens and 1920s realized that they had sort of created a profitable farming operation. These kids farmed vegetables and crops and pigs and cows, and they had a dairy farm, and they had a brick-making plant, and eventually they would take over all of the printing for the state government at a printing press. They did this all under the guise of training the children in, to have productive careers after they were released, but it was very profitable. And so the leaders of the school, through letters, encouraged the state legislature to expand the juvenile crime to include things like truancy and incorrigibility. And they said having too few kids makes the crops come in slow. And the state obliged. And so in the 19-teens and 1920s, you see this incredible spike in the number of kids being sent from all across the state to the state's one and only reform school, until that number reached almost 1,000 boys. It was the largest reform school in the country. But here you see a picture of sort of the origins of the construction of the school. And for many years, it did not have fencing around it. it was just an open campus. A lot of the boys who I spoke with remember showing up and thinking, this place is beautiful. You know, it's much better than the streets of Miami or wherever I came from. And it wasn't until they received a beating that they realized how horrible it was. Many of the worst beatings, anecdotally, happened after boys tried to run away, and this was a common thing, especially because of the conditions in which they were kept. So boys would try to run, and the staff at the school would pursue them, often through the swamps of North Florida, and bring them directly back to the White House for a beating. So as we began to learn more and more about the school, and really learn that this wasn't a secret at all, we started to put this story together. And you all don't necessarily need to see this, but this is sort of the construction of all of this research into story form. We also relied heavily on public records, and thank goodness Florida is a good state in which to work to get public records. We wound up getting about 14,000 documents from the Department of Juvenile Justice. When we started work on this story, the school was still open, and we got curious about what the school was like today. And so what you see here are documents reflecting some of the issues that this school had faced in recent time. And we learned that, it had been open 100 years, but it was still a nightmarish place for boys who had been sent there for reform. And a few years after we published a little bit of how the sausage is made, these are edits from my very mean editor. No, I love her. Remember what the first story looked like? For Their Own Good, we called it.
When was that?
That ran in April of 2009. This was followed later that year by a story called 100 Years Later and It's Still Hell. And the state very quickly started to figure out how to close the facility. And they closed the school in June of 2011, after 111 years in operation. There remained a mystery, and that was, let's skip forward in the slides a little bit here. On kind of a clandestine, forgotten about area of the campus, surrounded by pine woods and kudzu, there was a small cemetery with 31 pipe crosses. And this all came out when now paper thin, 2 dimensions, and pieces, tiny fragments of bone. The things that survived were mainly teeth and the inner ear. These are the 2 sort of densest bones in the body. But it was really something to behold. When they got to the bottom of the first hole, I was watching this young anthropologist sort of using, it started as a shovel and then went to a hand trowel, and then when they get down to the sensitive area, they're using like a tiny paintbrush to brush away dust. And it's almost an eerie thing to watch her work, because out of the red earth of Jackson County came what clearly were rows of baby teeth and then adult teeth on top of those baby teeth that hadn't yet come in, which gave an indication that this boy was pretty young. So slowly, one by one, they began exhuming the remains. And what you see here on the gurney is actually the first set of remains that came out of the earth, which turns out were the remains, ironically or coincidentally, of George Owen Smith, Ovell Krell's brother. They wouldn't know that for many months, but it looks like he's got some dimension to him, but they were actually removing the remains using a technique they called caking, which is sort of digging down well outside of what was known to have been the remains, and then bringing up the set of remains with the earth surrounding it. So they would make a cake basically in the earth and then slide under a piece of thin but stiff material so they could bring the whole set of remains out. They were finding some interesting artifacts as well, and you can't really see that necessarily right there in that dark photograph, but that's a burial shroud, sort of an ornamental burial shroud. They found 2 pennies, 1924 and 1925, right on where a boy's eyes would have been located. They found boys who were supine, but they also found remains that looked as though the casket had sort of been dropped into a hole, and the remains had all come down on one end and were kind of curled up in the fetal position. They found several ornamental casket decorations, including thumb screws, including a handle that had a small resting lamb on it. They found in one casket, I say in a casket, the caskets weren't there, but they sort of knew where they were. They found a bottle of embalming fluid that looked as though somebody had embalmed the body and then just tossed the bottle in. And they used each of these items to try to date the caskets, so they might have a sense of when the boys died and therefore who they were. So certain coffin hardware can be dated, and they would go through old catalogs to identify, oh, this piece was made by this local company at this time, and it makes sense that that's why it would have been there. The same for the ornamental burial shroud clips like that. They examined the dates on the pennies to give an indication of at least the earliest this boy would have died. The bottle of embalming fluid had a barely readable label, so they're able to track down the company that made the embalming fluid and therefore figure out something about the date of that child's death. Maybe the saddest artifact that they unearthed was a small marble in what would have been a boy's pocket, sort of down near his hip, an indicator that, I don't know, of youthfulness or sort of loss of innocence in that situation. The boys were buried not in rows. Many of the burials seemed to be just haphazard. They were all generally buried appropriately. I forget, is it east and west? Anyways, they had, so there was some level of rows, but then others were sort of out of whack, indicating that they had kind of over the years lost track of where the actual cemetery was. Various depths too. I think the shallowest was buried at 2.5 feet, and the deepest was about 8 feet. We did a graphic. I don't know if that's big enough to see, but we did sort of a graphic for the newspaper to help us explain this archaeological process to readers, showing some of the various tools they used and different techniques they used. If you look right here, that's one of the pretty close representation of one of the some of the hardware that they found, the coffin hardware. And everything they pulled out of the earth, they would sift and examine for artifacts. The remains where they were able to, I think almost all of the remains, 97%, they were able to get a good DNA sample from, either from, like I said, that bone that holds your the inner ear, or the teeth. The teeth were primarily the source for the DNA. The DNA had been so degraded that they had to try to identify using mitochondrial DNA. This is a worker in a lab in the University of North Texas, their DNA lab, which is the same lab that the FBI uses and others use. That mitochondrial DNA requires it deteriorates much slower than the other DNA. Somebody know what's the other one? I should know this. I wrote about it. Read the story. But it requires a comparative sample, to be taken from the maternal side of the family. And so many of these boys known to have died, it became a big challenge trying to track down someone on the maternal side of their family. Really, for many of them, we couldn't track down any of the family members, but trying to track down someone in the maternal line to provide a DNA sample. And sort of another little graphic explainer of how they use the DNA to begin to help identify the boys. It's a fascinating process. the boy's face at the top. That was USF. They were able to get enough skull remains, skull fragments from a handful of the boys that they were able to do facial reconstruction to sort of give you a sense of what the boy might look like. And they were trying to use this with the hopes that having facial reconstruction might help them identify some of the boys. They also did age dating. There are various ways you can examine bones to determine age. At death, there are various things that suggest disease of a certain kind. So you can examine the inner ear bone, and if that bone is porous, then it's an indicator of early childhood malnutrition or disease. So they learned quite a bit from the bones. They also found a piece of metal that was consistent with buckshot in what would have been the pelvis of one of the sets of remains. And they had the FDLE investigate this metal fragment. The FDLE was not able to conclude that it was buckshot, but it was the same size and weight as buckshot.
What's the FDLE?
Oh, Florida Department of Law Enforcement. That's the state's head law enforcement agency. And ultimately, they've been able to identify 9 boys and return 7 of them so far to their families. And this is a photograph from the funeral, the reburial of Thomas Varnado, who died at the age of 13 at the school. His family said that he was sent there for trespassing with his brother, Herbert, and he was healthy when he went, and he died within about a month of arriving at the school, and the school's official cause of death was pneumonia. So the family has long suspected that something else happened to Thomas Varnado. Nonetheless, they were able to positively identify his remains and bury him beside his brother and his mother in eastern Hillsborough County. And 76 years after his death, his family ran an obituary for the first time, which is kind of a neat thing. And I'll tell you that I cried a little reading it. So we did a 2-part series that accounts for Dr. Kimmerly's work on this project called The Lost Bones. I failed to mention that the locals did not really take kindly to the group of archaeologists from USF. Someone had put, before they got there to start the excavation, someone had put a deer camera in a tree overlooking the small cemetery. And they were never able to figure out who did it, but they felt like somebody was trying to watch them. There was a group of local citizens of the year named by the Chamber of Commerce who got together and held a press conference opposing the archaeologists, anthropologists who were trying to do this work. So they had to jump through some hoops. They had to overcome some adversity, but they were eventually able to do what they did.
On what grounds?
I'm sorry?
On what grounds?
That it's a core human right to be able to for a family to be able to have the remains of their loved one who died in state custody. That's the argument. Oh, you mean why did they oppose, or what grounds were they able? Okay, yeah. So they opposed. Well, they first of all, bad publicity. They complained a lot that this was hurting the tourism and business development in Jackson County. They don't go sticking your nose in our business. Who are these outsiders who are telling us? Who are trying to tell us our story. I think you'll see that's common though, in any time there's sort of this kind of truth and reconciliation effort, you'll see the entitled members of the community try to own their version of the story, their truth. And I think that's exactly what happened in this case. They felt put upon and embarrassed by the outsiders. They, to this day, contend that the school is a good place and it wasn't nearly as bad as everybody says. So, yeah, I think they saw it as an embarrassment. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 quick questions.
Sure.
One is, very early on in your speech, you mentioned there was a racial component.
Mhm.
I'm saying it twice, but I'd like you to elaborate. And then secondly, they were put in this school, reform place, but when would they be released? Were they ever to be released?
Yeah, that's weird because many of them, the time spent there was about a year, and but they had a system in which you could graduate out of the school, and it was all based on behavior. So they had a ranking system. You came in as a grub, and if you made it all the way up 5 or 6 ranks to pilot, suggesting you had reformed or you were acting well, then you could be released. The typical stay there was 8 months to a year, but many boys were sentenced at like 12, 13 years old. And a lot of these were already orphans or wards of the state or kids whose families didn't want them or who had no families. And they often stayed from the age of 12 until they graduated out at 18. So that there were boys there for 5 or more years.
And then my first question.
The racial component, yeah. So I just mean to say that there's a history of racial tension and racial violence in Jackson County, starting with the Battle of Mariana, moving on to the Jackson County War, where many blacks were killed by vigilante whites in the Reconstruction era, and then this place had a racial element to it because it was free labor, and the majority of boys being kept there were black. So it was sort of a graduation of Jim Crow. This was a workforce. There were 800 boys who were free workers. And the vast majority of them were black. So.
Of the 9 you identified, were any of those black?
Yes. In fact, 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, they buried a boy named Billy Jackson in Daytona Beach. His sister got his remains back finally. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Was there an adjudication process or a judicial process to deal with the infractions of each boy? And
you mean like criminal court?
Well, who decided they get sent there, and did the parent have to agree or pay anything? And then what if a girl would do the same crime or infraction?
So they didn't open a school for girls until the 1960s, and I think that was in Ocala. Maybe Gainesville, I forget. But so I guess girls didn't commit crimes until the 1960s. The criminal court component to this, I find no evidence of kids being given any sort of a fair trial until the late 1950s and early 60s. Before that, the sheriff said you did it, and you were sent to Mariana. There's no representation. And then I forget your middle question. What was that?
Well, so who exactly decided that they got sent to this school for boys? Did the parents have to sign off or agree, and did they have to contribute monetarily?
It changed over the years. No, the parents didn't have to. I've never seen any evidence to suggest the parents contributed monetarily. The signing off on it early on was really local law enforcement. If you're accused of, I can say for sure in 1934 when Thomas Varnado was sent, there was no trial. He was stripped out of his mother's arms by the sheriff and driven by the sheriff himself of Hernando County to Mariana. In the 50s and 60s, and then throughout modern history, it was a judge. It was a judge would send you to Mariana. And in fact, there's some controversy that crept up in that respect because some of the judges decided, I want to say in the early 1970s, that they wanted to see what this place was. So they were hearing from kids coming back into their communities that this was a hellhole. And so they went on a tour, like an inquiry, to see what the conditions were like there. And many of them were I know there were 2 in Pinellas County. Many of them came back to Pinellas County, and there were stories in the newspapers with these judges saying, I'll never send another kid there. Yes, ma'am.
What branch of the government, state government, supposedly had oversight of the school?
At first, it was the Department of Agriculture. In the, there was a farm, right? So in the, let's see, I want to say 1960s. Yeah, definitely early 1960s. It was taken over by DHS, Department of Health, DHR. What was that? It's like the Health, Department of Health. Yeah, yeah, and then after that, maybe in the 70s, early 80s, right before the Bobby M. lawsuit, it was taken over by the Department of Juvenile Justice, which had just been created. In the 1950s, the school had gotten so big that the state realized it needed another facility, and so
They never did any investigation?
well, there were investigations. I mean, there's a long history of investigation. In 1903, a panel dispatched by the governor in Tallahassee showed up at the school and found kids as young as 6 locked in irons. And this was a sensational news story. I mean, it ran in papers across the state. Nothing was done. Then you had the fire in 1914. Nothing was done. Then you had a massive expose in the Miami News, if you remember that publication, and nothing was done. A reporter for Christian Science Monitor showed up in the 60s and found a kid who had been locked in solitary confinement for like a month. He had eaten a light bulb and was bleeding internally, and nobody was caring for him. He writes this, what amounts to an expose that wins the Pulitzer Prize, not just about that school, but other reform schools across the country. They would promise reform, and then nothing was done. And it was like it's in a rural area. You got to remember, much of the history, I-10 didn't even go through there. So it was like Highway 90 was the only way to get to Mariana. And so, it's sort of hemmed in by the Chattahoochee and Chipola River. And so it, to this day, exists in sort of this like difficult to access part of the state. And I just think, they would promise reform and then people would look away. All the way through the 1980s. In 1983, the state settled a lawsuit brought by the Southern Poverty Law Center and the ACLU called the Bobby M. lawsuit. It was a class action suit, and it accused the state of locking kids in isolation for as many as 3 weeks and hog-tying them. And so the state agreed, we won't hog-tie kids anymore, and we won't lock them in isolation. And this was 1983. This is, not that long ago, but they were still treating kids in this fashion. And then when we investigated in 2009, just using public records, we found many, many instances of kids being abused. Not in the White House, not with corporal punishment, but kids being slugged in the face, or many times the guards would get their thrills by having 2 kids fight each other over like a single cigarette or a little Debbie snack cake. So it was still going, on. And that became like the Times editorial stance. Look, you've had your chance to fix this many, many times over, and nothing ever changes there. And then eventually they, I guess the state agreed and they closed the school.
What year was it closed?
2011, June of 2011. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
It's astounding because 2 months ago I was 35 miles west of Tallahassee and stayed in Mariana.
Yeah.
And they were touting, the Chamber of Commerce were touting about the war of Mariana, where people are buried under the roads.
Right.
And how people would run under buildings, just as you said, in back of headstones, shooting wildly. And
Right.
They won, and they were so proud of it. Everybody in Mariana was very proud of that war.
Oh, right, yeah.
And even the Danes of the, I was shocked, really shocked that the place had an eerie feeling, number one, and it was a very weird place, the Chipotle River, which was where the Indians were massacred and things like this, from the Creek Indians and stuff. It's a very, very, like you said, a very strange place. 35 miles from Tallahassee.
Right, yeah.
I mean, you get lost there. We didn't get lost, but we were hungry, and there was a subway that ran out of food.
Yeah.
Do we eat this? How well could this be? You know how strange it is there.
Yeah.
It's very strange. We went to the caverns, and did that route. They could hide a lot of people up there.
Sure enough. Yeah, and it's I love that its nickname is the City of Southern Charm.
Oh,
Yeah.
that lovely building and the great myrtles lining the streets. And
Right.
it's like they're so happy that people are buried under the entire, is it Route 90?
Highway 90, yeah.
Yeah, and that road.
Lafayette
and,
Street.
and people talk about the spirits and they see ghosts.
Yeah.
They should, right? They see a lot of ghosts. It's just like a backward place until you get, I guess, to Pensacola, and then maybe you're in civilization again. But it's.
Yeah.
And what about that plantation that's on the hill by the Chipotle?
Transylvania.
What's a good name?
Yeah, it was, so that was owned by a former governor of Florida, and he's actually the only sitting governor to have ever committed suicide. And he did so at the turning point of the Civil War, when it looked like the Confederacy was not going to win. And he famously said in the State House, "I'd rather be dead than not have slaves." And he went back to Transylvania and killed himself.
What was his name?
Milton, Governor Milton.
And that's the, he killed
So,
himself
you know-
instead of, because he had to have slaves?
Rather than give up the lifestyle of the,
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow, he's got his priorities in order.
right. But no, yeah, it's a, and you know,
Yeah.
it's also the locals don't necessarily like me around there. But I go and I talk to as many people as I can, and you know, and they're friendly on the surface, but I'll never forget. I was the one-armed man. I wanted to talk to him. Troy Tidwell is his name. He lives in downtown Mariana, and he won't talk to me. I've called his ex-wife. I've called all his family members. I've sent him a letter. And he lives in this little white house right near downtown Mariana. And so my photographer friend and I are parked outside, and we're just going to wait for him to come out, just so that I can give him the opportunity to, you know, say something, to defend himself, what have you. And I look, we're sitting out there 2-3 hours, and I notice some movement in the rearview mirror, and I look in the mirror, and there's a guy walking up, and he's carrying this long, like, steel rod, and he's walking directly toward our car. And I'm like, this guy is gonna, and we'd been talking to the neighbors and telling them who we were, and we were trying to get Mr. Tidwell, and oh, you don't want to talk, y'all gotta leave him alone, that kind of thing. Well, this guy, I elbow Edmund. I said, hey, there's a guy coming with a steel rod. I don't know what's going on, but just be ready. And the guy, he walks, and he gets right to the rear bumper of the car, and he turns, and he puts that rod in the ground and takes the water meter cover off. He's checking the water meter.
Story where the whorehouse during the war of Mariana, the whorehouse, the women came out. Did you hear that?
No, I didn't.
And the Chamber of Commerce lady whose Tidwell's house, that was Tidwell's house, that restored 3-story house with the huge outside, 3-story outside open patio.
Uh-huh.
You didn't see
This is where they have the History Center,
Yeah,
right?
the History Center. She was telling us about the horrors at that side. Were shooting at the Federals here, and they loved it. They loved the thrill of shooting, and they were doing it for their men. And some of these men were 12 years old. They
Yeah.
were fighting.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And-
No, the unofficial historian of Jackson County, a guy named Dale Cox, told me that he knows for a fact that there are still people who have.
The video they have of him going through town.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he kind of organizes all that. But he said that there are still people who have Claude Neal's, the lynch victim of 1934. They still have his fingers and toes in formaldehyde. Yeah. And I have no reason to doubt. I think he's probably right. They do, you know. I mean, they dismembered him. And yeah. In the back, right quick. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, when it comes to children's rights.
I think, yeah. I think, so look, I came away from this whole reporting experience with this thought. One of the most important, I'll argue with you all day about this, one of the most important positions in state government is that of a guard in a juvenile facility. And the importance of that person, the person who sleeps with the kid, not sleeps with the kid, but who's there while the kids are sleeping, if that person is a bad guy, you've got this kid right on the line, right? Somebody who's 13, 14, 15 years old and has made a bad decision to get in there and still has the possibility to change. If that person they're dealing with on a daily basis for however long their sentence is not a good person, they're creating a career criminal. You're creating somebody who's going to mess up and mess up and mess up again. With that in mind, what you need to be in that position in the state of Florida is a high school diploma or equivalent and the willingness to make minimum wage. Yes, children's rights have improved in some ways. There's still a long way to go. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to do what we can to pay attention to what's going on inside these facilities, because the state can't be trusted to monitor itself. They think they can. They told us, we know what's going on inside. We have all these checks and balances. And I'm like, did you know you hired a guy who 2 years before you hired him had broken his wife's arm in a domestic dispute, and now you've got him watching kids? Did you know you hired and put on suicide watch a man who never took a standard class in high school? He went through, he was, yeah, he was, his brother thought he had been hired to be a janitor, and he was put in a position where he was watching kids on suicide watch. You know, and this was news to all of them. Did you know you'd hired a guy who made a Facebook video that has him shooting guns and like shooting basketball hoops and laying on a pile of money smoking weed? That's the guy you want you know, working in a state facility with at-risk delinquents. So, yeah, the press should watch. You know, if you all have that ambition, you should watch too. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering if they had, when they exhumed the bones, did they find broken bones? Could they tell how the kid died, how he was beaten?
Yeah.
Skull fractures, anything like that?
The remains were unpreserved, and like I said, were in pine coffins that I'm sure deteriorated a decade after they were buried.
So what did they do with them?
Well, they still have. They're trying to decide what to do with them. So
No,
what?
I'm saying, what did the buriers do with the body if they were?
Oh, they just put them in a box and put them in the hole. You know. So they had yeah, and we're talking about some remains, right? And we're talking about some remains that are you know, that are over 100 years old. So the fire victims, 10 of them, well, they were charred remains. USF was able to determine that they had all been sort of shoveled into various boxes.
What about more recent burials?
Well, the last burial was in the last known burial at that site was in 1968, and that boy's remains too had deteriorated to the point where they weren't able to learn very much at all. One more quick question. It was that last slide up there. You don't need to see it, but we, because of the condition of these remains, were so bad, and because Erin knew pretty early on that she wasn't going to be able to determine cause of death, she decided to explore a boy who was reported to have been shipped home to his grandmother in Philadelphia. He had run away from Philly, somehow come to Florida, got in trouble here, and was sent to the reform school. And he died in the 1940s. And so she got the permission from the Pennsylvania State Police and the Pennsylvania prosecutor to unearth his remains. He was known to have been shipped home by train, buried in the same grave as his grandmother, on top of her, church burial, everything documented. So Erin begins the excavation process there, makes it down to what appears to be a shipping box that would be outside of the casket. So takes the wood off of that. Like, you can't really call it a lid, but what once was the lid on that box, removes all that out of the grave. Gets down to the casket, very clearly the casket. Telltale signs of, you know, this is it. Takes the lid off the casket, and there's nothing there. There's no human remains in that hole, which is an indication that whomever shipped that body, the school administration, didn't actually put the body in there. They sent home a box to this boy's grandmother. So that remains one of the mysteries of this place. Was somebody over here? Yeah.
Talk a little about what the prospects are for what happens next. Who owns this land? Does the state own it? Does the city of Mariana have any control over what happens next? I'm sure some people like to bulldoze the whole thing and build condominiums. Personally, I think it needs it needs to be remain as a place that keeps that history. I think there's a plan now to rebury the remains in Tallahassee.
Right.
How do people feel about that?
Yeah, so the land is owned by the Department of Lands. It's state-owned property. There have been all sorts of local efforts to repurpose the land. The local school board wants to buy a portion of it to build a new high school. Maybe a month ago, there was a committee appointed by various legislators to decide that very thing: what to do with this land, how to remember these kids. And they ultimately, I sort of disagree with this vote. There's a very smart guy on there who spent a career as the director of the Organization of Churches in Florida. But he was suggesting, look, we rebury the boys at the site, and we make an interpretive center so that we collectively have access to this memory, that this was a place in the way that Auschwitz was a place, and in the way that many other historic sites have been preserved and open to the public. He was ultimately overruled, and the committee, which was made up of members of the White House Boys, as they're called, this group of men who sort of brought this to light, decided that they didn't want any boys returned to Dozier. They wanted them out of there. And the boys, many of them who died trying to run away, they said we need to honor that idea that they were trying to get away from this place by reburying their dead in Tallahassee. They floated a number of ideas. They sent a recommendation to the legislature that there be some marker that tells the story of the school at Mariana on the site, and then another sort of funeral, more ornate stone and garden type of funeral area somewhere at Tallahassee. But they didn't make any kind of specific recommendations. I think it'd be cool to have a walkthrough, you know what I mean? Like you'd see inside the White House, and it's almost like a big museum or something, but that's not gonna happen, a church.
The big church,
Yeah,
tax free.
yeah, right, yeah. No, if my guess is if Jackson County gets that property back, it'll be a couple of months before it'll be like a Dollar General distribution site or something. And try to forget. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering how you felt upon completing the book. I mean, it sounds amazing and the stuff you did, and 7 bodies were returned to families. But I'm trying to think, and I can't remember all the names of books or movies, Blue Line, and there's even a recent one I read a lot. Anyway, and it caused justice to be served after these books or movies were made. And in your case, it sounds like you couldn't even get a hold of this Tidwell, whatever his name is.
Yeah.
So, how do you feel about that justice really has not been served?
Yeah.
And in the future, you could portend that these things, I'm thinking, continue in other states, if not this state.
Yeah. Well, just to correct you, I've not written a book about this. I did a long series of stories for the newspaper, but
okay.
I've always shied away from trying to make a profit off this story in particular.
Sorry. Yeah.
But I feel like, no, nobody was criminally prosecuted, and I feel like that's a crucial element of the whole truth and reconciliation thing. You should be made to confront your past, even if that involves prosecution in criminal court. That hasn't happened, but to witness the funeral for a kid who died 76 years before, and to witness the sort of collective relief that his descendants had, that for me was kind of the bookend. And to have the state really maybe a year ago for the very first time offer an apology to the survivors, that was big. And to have them acknowledge in a real way that this happened. You know, this isn't something that we've tried for years to brush it under the rug, but it's something we're finally going to have to acknowledge.
You might think to collect your essays and you could put them all together, and even if you don't want profit, if there were any profit, it could be donated towards something. Obviously, there's millions of things for young boys, you know, who have suffered and are still suffering.
My agent has entertained that idea, and she interestingly said, she's a New Yorker, but she interestingly said, "I don't like it, Ben." She said, "Would you buy that book?" It sounds so sad. And I was like,
Well,
no, I probably wouldn't. She said, would you buy it as a gift for someone?
Actually, I was thinking of research for people, because
Yeah.
You almost seem to indicate there are still these schools, or whatever they want to call them,
Yeah.
across the nation,
Yeah.
especially if this one just closed 5 years ago.
Right.
So I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about research and someone maybe who had the, whatever, to do something about this so the future would not
Yeah,
in any way, shape, or form happen.
I appreciate that idea. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, to me, when I hear the word justice,
Mm-hmm.
I hear that about not only commission, but omission.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry?
We would have another school.
Oh. I'm going to take a. Did you read about the dude who flew the gyrocopter and landed on the Capitol lawn? So that was my story. I think I'm going to do. I think I'm going to do that type of story for a little bit, just to take a breather from the dark. From the dark side. I'm sorry. Yeah. Thanks.
No, the reason I say that is because what you're doing is wonderful.
Thank you.
Your attention to so much hurt going on in this country.
Yeah. I appreciate that, and the thing is, it's like it becomes like a burden, like really a personal and emotional burden. And I've got 3 little kids, and they're great, but almost I feel like it's not a stretch for me to say, like, in the past 7 years, I've sort of had some symptoms of like PTSD, and I'll give you an indication of this. I'm talking to a man real quick. I'm talking to a man down in Miami, and I'm asking him about his experience. This was early on, first year of reporting. I'm asking about his experience, and I try to interview people to where they can tell me a story. They can go back in time and sort of see things to help me cinematically write about their experience. And so I'm asking him a lot of detailed questions, and he's stone-faced, and he's fine talking, and he doesn't seem to have any kind of issues. And he remembered he and a friend had gone into Mariana as a group. They were like a high rank, so they got special permissions. They had gone with a guard into Mariana to watch a movie, Bridge Over the River Kwai. And on the way back, he and his friend ducked off into the woods and tried to make a run for it. And they got caught by the dog boys that night, and they got taken to the White House. And this man's friend went in first. And so he's sitting in it's not the lobby, but he's sitting in like the front cell of the White House while his buddy is being spanked. And he's listening to the boy scream for his mama. And he said, it was such an emotional experience. I bent over and I picked up this pebble that was on the floor. And I just remember concentrating on it so hard and trying to put all of my thoughts into the feel and the shape of this pebble. And he's rolling it around in his fingers. And he says, I've never told anybody this. And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out that pebble. He still had it 50 years later. So, been married 6 times, can never settle down, moved across the state, never keep a solid job. But hearing those kinds of stories, like they have a tendency to hang with me, and that's a long way of saying I'll continue to do work to try to correct the record, or to try to make things right, or make the government work better, or whatever. This was like a really, really dark thing, and I'm just going to take a little break. I'm sorry? Wow. Yeah, so you know.
The things that I saw, the things I heard, the children I saw in hospitals and everywhere.
Right.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
And when I first started doing it, nobody really wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to believe that this was
Right. Right.
And they still don't want it.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Well, one thing about Floridians, the soul of the Floridians are good storytelling.
Yeah.
You've noticed that.
Oh, sure enough. Yeah.
I know
I'm gonna call it now.
Sure. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.